a beloved Hollywood actor known for his role as Chandler in Friends was found dead at his home in Los Angeles. Basically had so much ketamine in his blood, like the same amount that's used for anesthesia when you're like going down under and about to have surgery. And his assistant played a really big role as to how Perry was able to acquire the drugs. I have a really well-known actor here who's willing to pay top dollar for the drug. I wonder just how much this morn is going to pay. These are Hollywood vultures. They don't see Perry and people like him as human beings who are struggling. They see them as opportunity. So it's October 28th, 2023. A Hollywood assistant, Kenneth Iwamasa, is running errands like he would on any other day. He's worked in the same job for 30 years, and at this point, everything is kind of running like clockwork. He picks up a pair of prescription glasses, swings by the nearest Apple store, and drives back to his employer's house in the Pacific Palisades. And it's a beautiful property in a quiet clifftop neighborhood looking out across the Santa Monica Bay. Kenneth places a shopping bag down in the kitchen and stops to admire the view in front of him. He looks out into the backyard, over the pool and hot tub, to the still blue ocean in the distance. And that's when he notices it. There's something in the hot tub. His employer is floating face down in the water. At 4:17 p.m., Friends star Matthew Perry is officially pronounced dead due to the acute effects of a ketamine overdose. The same ketamine that his trusted assistant, Kenneth Iwamasa, had injected him with just 3 hours earlier. Now, before we get into today's case, I want to let you guys know that we are discussing an active criminal case that's ongoing at the moment. So we're only sharing information that is available to us at the time of recording. Now, some information may change as new evidence comes to light. Now, another full warning is if you're a fan of Matthew Perry, I am going to be mentioning some controversial and maybe even negative opinions about him. And these are not my personal opinions, but opinions and reactions to people that have been shared online. So if this is something that might upset or offend you, I wanted to let you guys know in advance. But let's not waste any more time and get into today's case. On October 28th, 2023, a beloved Hollywood actor known for his role as Chandler in Friends was found dead at his home in Los Angeles. Now, when dispatchers received a phone call letting them know that a famous A-list Hollywood celebrity was found dead, they initially thought that they were coming in for a cardiac arrest. Now, when they first arrived to the property, they could see that the person who had called 911 was holding Perry's head up, like above the water in the hot tub. And then, firefighters came as well. It was such a crazy scene. You had firefighters, police, emergency responders, essentially. There were so many people everywhere. But the firefighters came over and they took Perry out of the tub. And you could see pretty much straight away that he had already died before their arrival. Now, they noticed that he was not waterlogged, which meant that he was not in the hot tub for very long prior to first responders coming and prior to his assistant finding him. Now, with the scene already being super chaotic as it is, first responders start realizing, this is a pretty high profile celebrity. Like, there is going to be a huge media frenzy about this, like really, really soon. Even for those who are on the scene, seeing someone that they know, like not personally, but like it's as if you do know them because you see them in Friends and you see them in movies. It kind of feels that way when you see celebrities, right? Like you feel a sense of familiarity. Well, it was the same for them. And it was just so heartbreaking to see him in this state. But they've realized that they need to be careful as to how they navigate this situation because very, very soon, a lot of people in the media are going to find out about this. Now, when they had the first responders on the scene, they treated his death as non-suspicious. Like, it did not look like a homicide case, and they ruled it as an accidental death. And this was also because they saw that there was no forced entry. There was no immediate indication of foul play. Like, it did not seem like someone had broken into the house. Someone maybe, tried to steal things from the house and an altercation happened. None of that. It really did seem like that he had just died in his hot tub. Now, just 2 days after his death, his 5 co-stars from Friends shared a joint statement online, and they were utterly devastated when they heard the news. And at some point, social media was being flooded with the news of his passing. I remember a couple of years ago hearing about it as well, and I was pretty shocked because I had no idea about any of his, prior history or what could have caused it. Just A-list actor found dead in his hot tub. Like, what? How? Which we will get to in a little bit. But of course, people were just so devastated by it because it was also so unexpected. Like, Matthew Perry wasn't even that old. He was only in his 50s. Now, his death also was kind of global. It wasn't just isolated to the United States. Even Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, paid tribute to Matthew Perry. I'm going to refer to him as Perry moving forward because it's a bit easier that way. And he was just extremely shocked and saddened by his death. And, you might be thinking like, oh, Justin Trudeau, like that's a little random, but actually, Perry grew up in Ottawa, so his death was also a national moment in Canada as well. Now, the reaction was global. There were so many people who knew about Friends because that show aired virtually on every single country on Earth at the time that it was really popping. So for so many people, Chandler Bing, a character that was beloved by for so many generations, people were utterly devastated when they heard about it. Even though the circumstances around his death appeared relatively straightforward. It was an accidental drowning, as they had labeled it, but the autopsy is going to reveal a much more complex picture. So the cause of death was identified to be acute effects of ketamine. And ketamine, it's a drug. It's usually used for a general anesthetic to treat people, but it's also best known as a horse tranquilizer. And he basically had so much ketamine in his blood, like the same amount that's used for anesthesia when you're like going down under and about to have surgery. So this explains how he died via drowning, because he had so much ketamine in his system, he eventually reached a state of just passing out, like being fully unconscious, and then he just drowned. And we have to keep in mind, like when you're in a hot tub, it's really warm, you're really relaxed, you're just like laying back. There have probably been so many times that I have wanted to fall asleep, like in the hot tub. So I can imagine just like all of those factors combined, it must have been really hard for him to stay awake. The autopsy also showed that he had other physical signs of deterioration. He had coronary artery disease, which is a heart condition caused by plaque buildup. And that is most likely from the use of a lot of different pills. So we know how he died, right? But why was he taking the ketamine in the first place? Like, how did he have that much in his system to the point where he passes out in the hot tub and drowns from it? But before I get into that, I'm going to talk about what ketamine is, because some of us may not actually know the full effects of it. So many people know ketamine as a party drug. When people take it, they feel kind of like detached from reality, like really relaxed, maybe even euphoric. But ketamine is not just a party drug. It's actually used to treat people in medical settings. So in a controlled clinical setting, it's used as treatment for severe depression. And of course, this has to be done with careful monitoration by a medical professional. This is super important because you need to make sure that the doses you are giving to people are the correct amount. Otherwise, things could go very, very wrong, right? Now, in terms of how ketamine treats depression, it essentially helps reset the certain pathways in your brain that are responsible for mood and thought patterns. So people with really severe depression, these pathways, they end up getting stuck, because essentially you're stuck in this cycle of reinforcing all of these negative thoughts and feelings of hopelessness and this emotional numbness that comes with being depressed. And this ketamine treatment, it essentially increases communication between these brain cells and it helps them form new connections. And in that sense, it allows the brain to pretty much process thoughts and emotions differently. So for a lot of people, this is actually like a great treatment. But of course, people don't always respect powerful medications, and people do end up using it outside of a clinical setting where they're not taking it in moderation. And of course, this can have really dangerous, not only just physiological, but psychological effects as well, especially if you're using it for a really long time and in really high doses. So while ketamine can be a legitimate medical tool, it is also a drug that carries serious risks when it's used improperly. And it's especially risky for people who have a long history of drug abuse, addiction, and relapses. This is what was so shocking about Matthew Perry's death, because he had been in the limelight for decades. And even fans who loved his work, they didn't actually know how much he was struggling in his personal life. So we're going to backtrack a little bit to the early 90s when Matthew Perry won a role in the hit TV show Friends. As I had mentioned, he shot to fame for his role as Chandler in Friends. And at this time, he was 25 years old. So he was still relatively young, but he wasn't new to the industry. He had actually been acting since he was a teenager, but Friends was essentially like his big break and what turned him into an A-list celebrity. So by the time the show came out and he was only 25, like a lot of it came very, very quickly and he rose to fame very fast. But even after his role in Friends, he still went on to play in other TV, such as West Wing, which won an Emmy nomination. And I remember seeing him in that movie with Zac Efron, like 17 again. I think that movie was about, from what I can remember, like a failed 40-year-old father who is being played by Matthew Perry. And he kind of goes back in time to his 17-year-old self to correct his past mistakes, essentially. So Matthew Perry, he was a beloved actor, friend, son, and people just loved him for his role as Chandler because he played that role so well. And I think for a lot of people, when they heard the news of his passing, they couldn't really see him as Matthew Perry. Everyone saw him as Chandler. Like they couldn't look beyond that, which just goes to show how well he played that role. But it wasn't always so glamorous, you know, behind all the flashing lights and the Hollywood glitz and glam, he had a decades-long battle with drug addiction. Now, this kind of all started back in 1997 when Perry got into a really bad jet skiing accident and he walked away with a really serious injury. So this led him to being prescribed Vicodin, which is a really strong painkiller that's often used to treat chronic pain, and it's an opioid. And as we know, opioids are extremely addictive. So at just 28 years old, which is 3 years after he gets super famous from Friends, he's starting to develop a really serious substance abuse disorder. And throughout the years that pass, his mental health is just deteriorating. He's not only, struggling with substance abuse, but he also had depression and anxiety, which only makes his battle with addiction like 10 times harder. And he was just constantly in and out of hospitals. And this, of course, all resulted in a lot of physical issues as well. In 2018, he had ended up mixing a bunch of substances together, and this caused his colon to burst inside of him. And as a result, he fell into a coma for 2 months. Like, this is insane because your colon bursting, first of all, means that there's fecal matter in your abdomen, which is really bad. Like, that can be really fatal. And he's so lucky to have survived. But he was in a coma for 2 months, and he's lucky that he came out of it with not a lot of cognitive impairment, because after you come out of a coma, recovery is really, really slow, and it takes a really long time to get back to normal. For a lot of people, you have to go through months of rehabilitation, because during that time of, being in a coma, some people get muscle atrophy, cognitive deficits, emotional trauma. Some people wake up and they're completely different people. So that's super, super serious, really, really severe. He's so lucky that he didn't wake up with any brain damage. But this was the kind of experience that showed him, okay, this is getting really bad. I almost died. It's time for me to get my shit together and, try to seek out help. I think at that point, he's starting to realize that if he doesn't take action soon, he will die due to drugs. And it's just such an unfortunate tragedy to see the outcome, because it seemed like he really did try. He was in and out of rehab, over 15 times throughout the years. He spent millions of dollars trying to get sober. But in the end, it seems that, he always relapsed, and eventually he was seeking out things that were, stronger. He was looking for stronger drugs. And in 2022, he released a memoir titled Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing. Now, a memoir is a nonfiction narrative based on the author's own personal memories and experiences. So he had written this himself. And I did not read his memoir. So what I'm about to say is all things that I have seen people say online. But I was really curious to see, what was the public reaction of him releasing his memoir? Because I had only known good things about him, and I had known that a lot of people loved him because of, friends and whatnot. But when I looked into it, it seemed like his memoir talked a lot about, his near-death experiences. So these things that I had mentioned, him going into a coma and his jet skiing accident, these were all things he had talked about in his memoir. And he shared a lot of information about his personal life, like how he was handling addiction, how much it impaired his personal life. And he even admitted that through seasons 3 to 6 of filming Friends, he doesn't remember any of it, like at all, because that's just like how much he was drinking and how much drugs he was doing for what? Nearly a couple of years of your life. Just imagine it's a blank slate. Like you don't know anything that had happened. So when I looked into this a little bit more to see, what did people think about his memoir though? These were some of the things that they had said. I don't know if I can finish Matthew Perry's memoir. Has anyone read beyond the first 50 pages? It comes off like he's writing with the choice of his full self with no awareness of that and no attempt to delve beyond the obvious, oh yeah, I'm one screwed up guy. I waited forever to get it from the library and listen to him narrate. I did finish it and I have some mixed feelings. The more I reflect on it, the less I like it. Now, these were just a couple of comments that I had seen, but then as I kept going, it seemed like the majority of people weren't the biggest fans of his memoir, and that's for a lot of reasons. I think first, a lot of people had said that his memoir kind of came off as a little bit out of touch in the sense that he made himself to be this big, great victim of struggling with substance abuse, and that there was just nothing he could do to, recover from it. And any sort of comparisons to other people who were also going through addictions, he would say things like, oh, well, I have it a lot worse though. This is what people had said because, again, I had not read it. Someone else had said, for someone who was so open about his addiction, he took no ownership. For someone who claims to be currently sober and going through a lot of therapy, you would think he would recognize his active role he plays in all of his relapses. Another one said, I have a pretty tender heart towards addicts in general and found his reflections so off-putting. I'm a big Friends and Matthew Perry fan, but I struggled to get through it. Honestly, I actually like him less after reading it. A memoir is supposed to be a very vulnerable, intimate thing. You're sharing a lot of details about your personal life, but it seems like for some people, it didn't come off in a sympathetic way, but rather it made people feel, a little bit uncomfortable. It was just a lot of vulgarity, a lot of details about his, struggles with substance abuse. And it's not to shame someone who is going through all of that, but to people, their impression was that Matthew Perry did not seem like he was ever going to get better. And instead of taking the mentality of, I'm struggling, but I'm trying, it was like, I'm struggling, I've tried, and I don't think I'm ever going to get better. And, someone said, this guy is not going to stop doing drugs and it's going to lead to his death. So even after his memoir was, received by the public, a lot of people read this and went, this is not looking good for him. Like, I don't think he's ever going to stop doing drugs. And well, 1 year after he released it, he did end up dying. So people were not, that far off, unfortunately. Now, it is up to you guys to decide for yourselves how you want to interpret this memoir and if you want to decide if it's like something that's worth reading. Now that we know his history with drug abuse, we're going to go to the final months that led up to his death. In Perry's final months, he was undergoing these medically supervised ketamine therapy for depression and anxiety. And it seemed like for a while this was actually really helping him. But at one point in time, he ended up wanting like stronger doses. He started to feel like, yeah, this is not really doing it for me anymore. Like, I want to feel more out of this. But of course, this treatment he was receiving was in like a controlled clinical setting. done by doctors, and they refused him. They said, look, we can't increase your dosage. Like, this is the most that you can get legally and ethically. It would not be good for you. But he still wanted more out of ketamine. He wanted stronger doses. So the fact that his doctors were not willing to provide it for him, this is kind of when he decided to look, outside of a clinical setting, and was looking to buy, stronger doses of ketamine and other drugs from like an outside source, from a drug dealer. He was trying to find a drug dealer. Of course, being a celebrity and a high profile person, Perry has connections, like he's well connected. So he used these connections and the people around him to help him find even more drugs. Now, someone who played a really big role in all of this was Kenneth Iwamasa, which was Perry's live-in assistant. Now, Iwamasa is around 60 years old, and he was actually Perry's personal assistant since 1994. Which is a really long time, like nearly 3 decades they had been together. So not only was, Iwamasa working for Perry and taking care of him and doing all of this like assistant duties, they lived together. Like they were roommates as well. And on Iwamasa's LinkedIn profile, his occupation was listed as a talent manager and someone who thrives in chaotic situations. And I feel like it honestly perfectly describes his situation with Matthew Perry, because a lot of Iwamasa's job was deeply tied to Perry's sobriety. He had a lot of responsibilities that included, coordinating medical appointments on behalf of Perry and pretty much just making sure that he would take his medication and try to stay sober. He was basically his like sober companion on top of like all the other duties he was already doing as his personal assistant. So that's kind of a big responsibility. Like that's a lot for someone to take on. And this wasn't something that just happened in the short term as well. For nearly 30 years, Iwamasa was by Perry's side and he saw everything. He was with him until literally the very, very end. So it's very clear Perry trusted him a lot, and they were very deeply, intertwined with one another's lives. And so they were also really close. Like we're going to assume they had a pretty good relationship if like A, he's working with and for Perry that long, and B, they live together. So, when Perry asked for drugs, Iwamasa was there to help him get it. I mean, any assistant would do that for their boss, right? So Perry had ended up with so much ketamine in his system that he was able to use it far beyond the recommended dosage. But the key question is like, how was he able to do it? Well, as we know, he had connections and his assistant played a really big role as to how Perry was able to acquire the drugs. But of course, it wasn't like Iwamasa, knew the top tier drug dealer and just went to them directly and got the drugs. It doesn't really work like that. There was another key figure in this whole network of drug distribution, and that was Eric Fleming. Now, he's a pretty interesting figure in this case. When I was researching about him, the more that I learned about him, the more that I just really started disliking this man. So Fleming used to be a film director and TV producer, so he was also, in the Hollywood industry. And this man has no medical credentials, like whatsoever. But he somehow was able to transition his career into working at a substance abuse treatment center in Bel Air. And this place was called the Red Door. And he basically worked there as a sober living manager. And his priority was to essentially help people overcome their addictions. But do you think this is what he did? No. He used this as an opportunity to take advantage of vulnerable people to pretty much make money. That was the end goal, just to make money no matter who got hurt along the way. Now, you might be thinking, how is he working at a substance abuse treatment center without any medical credentials, right? This institution, they had a really bad reputation. They would oftentimes hire people like Fleming, like those who had no credentials or like really questionable credentials, because it was owned by 2 people who owned a previous rehabilitation center that had multiple patients that died there. In 2021, a patient at the Red Door, so not their previous rehabilitation center, like this one now that we're talking about, they died of a fentanyl overdose. And when there was an investigation, staff couldn't explain how this person was able to obtain it. So that's crazy. I mean, you have really vulnerable people going to this rehab center to stop using drugs and to recover. And they had someone who died there of an overdose and no one could explain how he got his hands on it. That's awful. And it's super sus. So it's really clear from, Fleming's actions to work at a place like that. He's not trying to help anyone recover. He was basically facilitating access to drugs. And at some point, he ends up becoming really involved with a, high-end supplier that he ends up connecting to Iwamasa and Perry. So for Fleming, working at this rehab center, it was just to be able to find a way to have access to drugs and to also take advantage of vulnerable people to scam them of their money, essentially. Fleming's role is a little bit different from these next two doctors that I'm going to be talking about, but they were all involved in the drug scene nonetheless. And the outcome was the same. Horrible people focusing on greed and taking advantage of those who were really vulnerable. So these next two physicians, Salvador Placencia and Mark Chavez, okay? Mark Chavez, he was a San Diego physician who had operated a ketamine clinic called Dreamscape Ketamine in Mission Valley. And he worked at the clinic until around July 2023, but ended up getting into some sort of weird altercation with a co-founder, so he left that clinic. But he didn't just, leave diddly-daddly. He ended up taking a bunch of prescription drugs with him from the clinic, including a lot of ketamine, which obviously this is illegal to do. He also used two methods to fraudulently obtain more drugs from the clinic. So one of the first things that he did was that he filed a fraudulent prescription, okay? Everything he had filled out is not true. It's all illegal. And this was to obtain 30 200 milligram ketamine lozenges in a real patient's name, by the way. But that patient, of course, had no idea and did not consent to any of this. And not only that, when he was ordering from wholesale suppliers, he lied on the forms, claiming that he was still employed at that Dreamscape, a ketamine clinic, when he wasn't. So, yeah, this is fraud. Then, in September of 2023, Salvador Placencia, so they know each other because they used to be ex-colleagues, but it seemed like Chavez and Placencia, they were also friends for 20 years. So they had known each other for a really long time. And basically, he calls Chavez up and he's like, hey, I have a really well-known actor here who's willing to pay top dollar for the drug. Do you think we can make something happen? And Chavez was, immediately hooked. I mean, he's like, hell yeah, I have a huge supply that I've stolen. I need to get rid of it. This is perfect. And at some point, Placencia even, texts Chavez saying, I wonder just how much this morn is going to pay. Which you can see that these are not medical, reliable people. These are Hollywood vultures. They don't see Perry and people like him as human beings who are struggling. They see them as opportunity, as something to take advantage of to exploit for money. So Chavez and Placencia, now working together, they sold at least 22 100 milligram vials and 9 lozenges of ketamine to Iwamasa, who then would give it to Matthew Perry. And get this, they overcharged them as well. They sold the ketamine vials for roughly $2,000 a vial, but at wholesale price, it would be $12. $12 to $2,000. So they were making so much money because Iwamasa and Perry, they didn't know this is how much it costed. They didn't know it'd actually only be $12 at a wholesale price. So they were also being actively scammed. But Perry, even though it was really expensive, it didn't really seem to faze him because he wanted the drugs and was willing to pay however much he needed to get it. So it's very clear that this wasn't just, a single dealer. You have Fleming, who would oftentimes sell drugs to Iwamasa, who would give it to Perry. Then you have these other physicians who would also do the same thing and sell it to Iwamasa, who gave it to Perry. So you have these two different suppliers supplying a bunch of these drugs. So it wasn't just a single dealer that was involved. It was pretty much a chain of people who were enabling access, and they were just making so much money from it as well. On October 12th of 2023, so this is exactly 2 weeks before Perry's passing, Salvador Placencia, the physician I had mentioned earlier, he goes over to Perry's house on that day and they're setting things up to eventually inject Perry with a bunch of ketamine. And, they do their normal process. At this point, it was kind of routine for all of them. But then suddenly, as they were doing it, Perry just freezes up and his blood pressure spiked like crazy and he had a really bad negative physical reaction. Like it was very clear that his body was physically rejecting the drugs. Like it was really bad. He was not in a good state. And this really scared everyone who was there. Iwamasa was very concerned, but Placencia, even the doctor who earlier even, was saying to Chavez, like, oh, I wonder how much this moron will pay. He walked away from the situation being kind of shaken up by it. Like he even texted Iwamasa saying, let's not do that again. Because for the first time ever, even though they were doing these regular routine injections of ketamine, this time he was there to see Perry literally have like a really bad reaction to the drugs that he's administering to him. And I think right then and there, he had this realization of like, okay, I'm involved with something that's actually going to be really, really bad if, this were to progress into something worse. Next time, he may not even, recover from said physical reaction, which is what happened. But this moment really, really scared him. But it's not because he cared about Perry's well-being and he was now suddenly concerned for him, kind of realizing, oh, this drugs that I'm giving him is, doing harm to him. It wasn't about that. It was about himself. It was about Placencia not wanting to get involved with someone who could potentially die from doing this, and then he is now implicated. So don't get me wrong. It wasn't like he suddenly had a change of heart and was like, okay, I'm going to stop dealing drugs because now I had firsthand seen the negative effect it can have on people. It was more like, I don't want to be involved in this if something really bad were to go down. And this is made clear by the fact as well that he still left extra ketamine behind at Perry's place, knowing that Perry would most likely take it and not caring how it would affect him after that. So it's really clear that he wasn't there to help Perry. He was simply there to continue to exploit him, even though he could firsthand see the negative effects that it was having on him. So you have this incident where Perry has this really bad physical reaction to the drugs that he's doing. And by the way, this wasn't even the first time something like this had happened, right? He had gotten sick in the past from doing a bunch of drugs. He had so many negative altercations. There was just a lot of signs for a really long time that Perry was going down a really dark path with no return. And yet, in 2003, so that same year when he passed away, in just 29 days, he had spent roughly $55,000 on ketamine. And this was all provided by Eric Fleming, right? So now we have that other supplier who was giving a bunch of drugs to Perry. Eric had a high up supplier, right? You would think, oh, Fleming is the one who has the drugs. No, he was actually the middleman. So he had someone above him. He advertised his supplier to Perry and Iwamasa as someone who was this high profile drug dealer. They have the really good stuff. It's legit. They only sell to celebrities, making it sound like it's super exclusive. I mean, it's just all marketing, right? And he said, hey, I'll give you guys one vial for free so Perry can try it. And if he likes it, let me know. He can buy more. I have so much from my supplier. So Perry ends up taking the vial and he was like, yeah, I like it. So Iwamasa contacts Fleming again and says, hey, like Perry likes it, I'd like to buy more. So Fleming ends up buying around 50 ket vials from his provider and sells them all to Iwamasa. And at some point they get into this really regular routine of buying drugs from Fleming, Iwamasa, collecting it on Perry's behalf and then injecting the ketamine into Perry. Iwamasa, by the way, has no medical credentials whatsoever. His personal assistant is administering the drugs into him, like injecting it, okay? There's a lot of different ways you can take ketamine. It can come in the form of like pills, in powder, and in clinics that people go to, I'm pretty sure that they do it via injection. So now imagine Perry's doing all of this in like his home, in his backyard, in his hot tub, where he has zero monitoring and no understanding of just how much he's actually taking And it doesn't seem like Iwamasa was aware of the dosages either. They were just kind of doing, whatever felt good to Perry. So for many, many months, Iwamasa is, taking all of these drugs from Fleming and giving it to Perry. And they have like a pretty good routine going. And Fleming is making so much money. I mean, $55,000 worth of ketamine in just a 1 month period. That is crazy. So it seemed like, this system around Perry, it wasn't slowing him down. This was all enabling him, pushing him to further fuel his drug habits. So as I had mentioned before, Fleming used to just independently provide a lot of drugs to Iwamasa, but then at some point in time, he did cross paths with Chavez and Placentia, who were also known to be, supplying a bunch of drugs. But it got to a point where Perry was buying so much from Fleming that Chavez and Placentia couldn't even keep up with the demand. So at some point in time, Fleming had to go and find another supplier. And, he had been in Hollywood for a while, so he had a bunch of connections. And he did end up finding a woman named Jasveen Singha, the same supplier that he advertised as like a high profile dealer, only sells to celebrities. Now, she is probably one of the most important figures in this case. Like, she's at the very center at all of this. Now, Singha was born in London in 1983, and she had a, relatively normal upbringing, pretty, upper middle class family. But at some point, her mother remarries and their whole family moves to Calabasas, California. And around that time, she's going to university. She gets a degree in business administration, all pretty standard stuff. In her professional life, she works in finance for a little bit. And then at some point, she's like, you know what? I kind of want to run my own nail salon. So she tries that, but the business fails. And at that same time, she's undergoing a lot of plastic surgery. I think it just kind of goes to show like how invested she got into the kind of cultural, like Hollywood party life that happens when you're in California. Because at some point, she also starts working as a party promoter in Hollywood. And she would hang out with a lot of famous people like DJ Khaled, Charlie Sheen. And so through the nightlife and through the party scene, she was able to slowly start building her connections into the wealthy, exclusive Hollywood circles. Now, at the same time, while she's, being a nightlife party promoter and hanging out with all of these celebrities and going to all these cool parties, this is when she also started cooking ketamine in her own home. And she would bring the ketamine to these parties and start distributing it to everyone. And everyone would be like, oh my God, it's Singha with the drugs, like shout out to her. And at some point, she started to build a reputation for herself as the ketamine queen of North Hollywood, because this is what she was known for, promoting parties and being the life of the party, because she was always there to have drugs like on her and just ready to sell to whoever needed it. And she was operating this whole thing out of her apartment. It was basically a huge drug distribution hub. And it wasn't just ketamine that she had meth, cocaine, Xanax, pretty much any party drug that you could think of. She had it. She had it all. Now, at around 2019, so going back in time a little bit to explore Singha's past, for her operations were running really smoothly. She was selling drugs. She was going to these parties. And one time she sells ketamine to a customer. His name was Cody McLaury. And he ended up dying from an overdose after he bought and used those drugs from Singha. It seems like Singha was fully aware that her product caused his death. She found out about his passing, and she also found out that it wasn't due to other drugs, it was her drugs that she had sold to him. And she even Googles, can ketamine be listed as a cause of death? What? So you are selling a bunch of drugs, yet you have to search on the internet as to whether or not these drugs that you're selling can kill people, which just goes to show how unaware she was of all of this. She didn't understand the risks. She didn't know like what harm she was actually causing. But of course, if she searched this up, that meant she also got results. That makes it really, really clear, like, yes, ketamine can cause death. So she knew she was responsible for this man dying. And do you think that she stopped doing drugs or, stopped selling drugs? No. She continued to deal drugs for many years after that, actually. Like, it didn't seem like a man dying because of her product. It didn't stop her. She didn't seem to care, which I feel like shows exactly the type of person that she is. So now we're going to the couple of days before Matthew's death. There was a $6,000 cash deal that happened, and this includes the ketamine that would end up being fatal for Perry. Singa had sold over 50 vials of ketamine to Fleming, who then gave it to Iwamasa, knowing that it was going to be for Perry. Like, she always knows who the drugs is going to and who they're for. Because again, she deals to high A-list, celebrities. So she's always aware of who's actually her customer, even if these celebrities oftentimes have like middlemen in between them. But you can pretty much see like there is a really clear chain of distribution. You have Singa, who is like at the very top, making all of these drugs and then providing it to Fleming, who is the middleman who basically helps distribute it on her behalf. And then you have Iwamasa, who is Perry's personal assistant. So you have like these two middlemen, in contact, and then Iwamasa distributing the drugs, or not distributing, but administering the drugs to Perry. So we have a very clear network of people. We also have those two other physicians who are like kind of involved in that middle chain as well. They would sometimes provide to Fleming or sometimes deal to Iwamasa directly. And all of these people were basically just making so much money from all of this that they did not care how this was all going to end. They didn't care who was maybe getting hurt in the process. And they knew the risks. They were fully aware that Perry was an addict and that this could lead to his death. And it did lead to his death. Now we kind of understand a bit more like how Perry ended up with basically an unlimited supply and access to ketamine, but what exactly happened on his final day. So on October 28th of 2023, on Perry's final day, at 8:30 in the morning, he receives his first injection from Iwamasa. So, he doesn't eat breakfast or he doesn't have a coffee like, most normal people would. He wakes up and the first thing he does is get an injection of ketamine. And at this point, it's like so routine and almost seemingly normal for Iwamasa and Perry that no one even questions the fact or takes a step back to think, having like a ketamine injection first thing in the morning probably isn't a good thing. Then at 11 a.m., like kind of an hour and a half after his first injection, Perry is playing pickleball. So at this point, he kind of like seems okay. I mean, he's active, he's exercising in his house. So even though he just had a ketamine injection an hour and a half before, he's still basically like highly functioning, which I feel like goes to show just kind of how numb Perry was to all of it. I think for anyone who's taking these like regular injections of ketamine to then be able to go and exercise, like ketamine makes you feel really relaxed, right? To the point people go unconscious. But here he is just playing pickleball, doing a really, high active exercise. So for him, like he's already at a point where like already have my morning injection. Now I need another dose. So at 12:45 p.m., he gets his second injection of ketamine. Now, soon after that, like less than an hour later, Perry decides, okay, I want to go into my hot tub. I want to relax now. Like I had just played some pickleball. I have my injection of ketamine. It's a great day. Let me go into my hot tub. So he calls Iwamasa over and he's like, hey, shoot me up with a big one. And at this point, this is less than an hour after his second injection, right? It's not even like halfway through the day and he's already had his third injection of ketamine. And as always, Iwamasa complies. He doesn't question it. He gives Perry his ketamine. That is the last, thing Iwamasa ever does to Perry. This is the last interaction that they have with one another. And not only that, that's the last thing that Perry says. Shoot me up with a big one. Those were his last words, which I feel like is just so tragic because it truly defined, how his life was ruled by drug addiction. And after that, Iwamasa sees Perry, relax in the hot tub. He's thinking, yeah, this is normal. This is what we always do. I'm going to go leave now and run some errands. And that's when he returned at 4 p.m. and finds Perry face down, dead in the tub. So even though at first Perry's death was ruled as an accident, investigators, they didn't just leave the case and was like, okay, that's it. They were obviously asking questions like who supplied the ketamine? Where did he get these drugs from? And why was it being administered in this way? So there was a huge federal investigation that happened from all of this. Not to mention, he's a pretty famous celebrity, so this was a high profile case. And investigators they start looking into phone records and text messages, and they find this encrypted app called Signal. And it's a messaging app. It's really similar to WhatsApp or Telegram. It kind of has a reputation of it being used by drug dealers because it's like encrypted and safe. And very quickly, they're able to discover like a whole coordinated network of people that were all involved in distributing drugs. And they could see like this was not an isolated incident just between Iwamasa and Perry. This goes far beyond them. The evidence that they're going through, not just the phone records, but they can also see these huge financial transactions that are being made. They eventually uncover like the number of people who are involved. And very quickly, the name Jasveen Singha pops up many, many times. And they were able to determine that she was the one who supplied the ketamine. She already had a reputation amongst her. So just with like a little bit of investigating, like it wasn't that hard for them to find out because it wasn't exactly like she was low-key about anything. Like she was literally called the ketamine queen. So, tracing it all back to her wasn't that difficult to do. And they were able to see that her drugs was what led to Perry's death. And there were also a bunch of text messages that they uncovered showing that she was completely aware that the drugs were for him. When they were doing the investigation, right, the death of Matthew Perry was, leaked pretty quickly. Like a lot of people found out. There's a huge media frenzy. And when Singha heard about Perry's death, she messaged Fleming via that Signal app and she told him, hey, delete all of our messages. Like we cannot have like anything showing our connection to him whatsoever. And okay, come on. If you're doing this, it clearly shows your guilt. You don't want to be, incriminated in all of this because she knew it does not look good for her. But guess what? Even after Perry had died and she knew about his death and she knew that the drugs he took were her supply, she continued dealing drugs. She did not stop. It was very similar to the previous situation when Cody McLaury passed away. She didn't stop then and she wasn't going to stop now. And at some point, Fleming also texted Singha being like, hey, can you please call me? I need to get more information and I want to bounce some ideas off of you. I'm like 90% sure everyone is protected. I mean, I never dealt with Perry directly, only his assistant. So the assistant is the enabler. So Singha continued dealing and was having conversations about, avoiding responsibility and her involvement in everything, telling Fleming to delete the messages, Fleming texting Singha being like, well, we didn't deal directly with Perry, so we're not involved in all of this. We can put it on the assistant. It's not us. And, he's not entirely wrong. Iwamasa was definitely an enabler in a lot of ways, but I think his situation and involvement with Perry was a lot more different. It was a lot more personal and more intimate. They had known each other for many years. They lived together. And I think there was just a lot of complicated, emotional involvement for Iwamasa. So that's not to say that I'm justifying what he did, because it is so wrong in so many ways. And he definitely did enable Perry. But it's different in the sense that Singha, Fleming, Placentia, Chavez, they were all dealing drugs and giving it to Perry to make money off of him, not because they had some sort of emotional connection to Perry or this sense of responsibility like Fleming did. Nonetheless, though, all of these people contributed to the chain of exploitation and drug distribution. So in March of 2024, Jasveen Singha was arrested on drug-related charges. So this was around a year after Perry had died. But initially, she was released on bond, but then she was later rearrested in August. And then, her bail ended up getting revoked and she just remained in custody until her trial, which I will clarify the details of in a little bit. But on March 2024, so around the same time of her arrest, her North Hollywood home, which was also known as like her stash house where she made all the drugs and whatnot. It was like the central hub of her operations. It was raided by federal agents and they found so much drugs. They found huge amounts of meth, nearly 80 vials of ketamine, ecstasy, Xanax, coke, just honestly, anything that you could think of, she had it all there. And she wasn't the only person that got in trouble, though. Like, all 5 people were charged in this case. So we have Jasveen Singha, the supplier. We have Eric Fleming, the middleman. We have Kenneth Iwamasa, the assistant, administering the drugs to Perry. And we have Mark Chavez and Salvador Placencia, who also have, a whole history of just doing really illegal, really sus things with drugs, not even involved or directly tied to Perry. But of course, in this case, all of their charges were only in relation to Perry and not things separate from him. So some of these charges included the distribution of controlled substances, conspiracy to distribute drugs, distribution resulting in death, and maintaining a drug-involved premises. And, they also have these really important text messages between a lot of these people, especially between Chavez and Placencia, when they said, "I wonder how much this moron will pay." Like, there was just a lot of evidence against them, and they didn't really do a good job of, hiding their tracks. Not to mention they raided Singa's house, which had all of these drugs there. So it wasn't looking good for any of them. It did not seem like they were going to win their trial. There is obviously a lot going on here. We have 5 different charges. We have 5 trials in total. And like I had mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is an ongoing case. So some of these people haven't even been sentenced yet. But before I get to the sentencing, over the course of 2024 to 2025, 4 defendants ultimately pleaded guilty. So for a lot of them, there's actually no full jury trials. So we have Salvador Placencia. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, and Mark Chavez was sentenced to 8 months of home confinement for his role in a conspiracy to illegally distribute ketamine, plus 300 hours of community service. Now, a lot of people online, when they heard this, was infuriated because 2.5 years in prison, Mans is going to be out so soon. It's almost going to be as if nothing had happened to him. Are they really facing any sort of punishment here? 8 months of home confinement. I could stay at home for 8 months. A lot of people were saying that this is not fair sentencing. They played a really big role. They contributed to, this supply of drugs. They've hurt a lot of people along the way, not just Perry as well, but it really seems like they were pretty much just getting a little slap on the wrist. Now, we do have Iwamasa, who is being sentenced on June 10th of this year, and Fleming, who's being sentenced on April 29th. So, as I had said before, we don't have the details of what's actually happened to them. We may do an update video in the future. If this is something you guys might be potentially interested in, let me know in the comment section down below. But, other than all of these defendants, Singa was actually the last person to hold out. So for many months after she was arrested, she did not plead guilty originally like everyone else did. And only 3 weeks before her court appearance, she pretty much struck a deal with the U.S. Attorney's Office to switch her plea to guilty. So on September 3rd of 2025, she appears in a federal court downtown LA. She's there, in shackles, in, the prisoner uniform. And, I bet for someone who lived such a glamorous life and was, always involved in these high-end parties and whatnot, to be in a public courtroom dressed like that must have been so humbling for her. Now, she did acknowledge that the drugs she provided to Fleming were for Perry, and she pleaded guilty to 5 federal charges. So 1 count of maintaining a drug-involved premises, 1 count of distribution resulting in death, 3 counts of ketamine distribution, and all of these charges could lead up to a maximum sentence of 65 years in prison, which is a really long time. 65 years, but on April 8th of 2026, she was actually only sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. So you can clearly see the worst that could have happened, which was 65 years in prison, but she ended up getting only 15, which, 15 years is still a long time, but she can still get out and live a relatively normal life after the fact. So again, a lot of people were really infuriated about this and just felt like, is she really going to learn her lesson? Is Mark Chavez and, Salvador Placencia really going to learn their lesson? And, it's great that there is some sort of justice served on behalf of Perry, because a lot of drug dealers and whatnot, in a lot of these cases of overdoses, you don't always have these types of closure. You don't always have these dealers being put behind bars. But where is Cody McLaury's justice? Where is his closure? It's great to see that Perry and his family, got to walk away feeling a little bit resolved from all of this. But how about Cody McLaury? But otherwise, Perry's stepmother, Debbie Perry, she did make a statement, a victim impact statement. And when she said these words, she locked in on Singa, like really intense direct eye contact, and said, "The pain you caused is irreversible. You clearly had a talent for making money, but you chose to hurt people. How sad." She then turned to the judge and asked her to please give this heartless woman the maximum prison sentence so she won't be able to hurt other families like ours, which we can see did not happen. 15 years is good, but it's not great. Now, Perry's stepfather, who is Dateline's NBC's Keith Morrison, so he's also quite famous. He's also, involved in the Hollywood industry. He also addressed Singa directly and said, "I don't hate you. You're a drug dealer. You supplied an addict." I think that's a pretty interesting thing to say, because I think that's him acknowledging the role that Perry had to play in all of this. Like, yes, Singa supplied the drugs and a lot of people took advantage of the situation and was enabling Perry, but Perry is also responsible in the sense that he made these choices. And look, being an addict is a really complex, mentally, physically debilitating thing that I will never ever shame. Like, we're not here to shame anybody for their struggles, but we are here to recognize that to some extent, you must take accountability for yourself. At the end of the day, he was also an adult, and these were also clear choices that he was making. Now, it begs the question for, Kenneth Iwamasa, who is also a fully grown adult, who is also there to see the many years that Perry had struggled with all of this. And it begs the question, just like, why did he not say no? Or why did he not say anything? Was there ever a moment in time when he thought to himself, like, this is too much? Like, I don't want to be involved in this anymore, or Perry clearly needs help. I'm just really wondering, what was he thinking throughout all of these years? Or did he just get to a point where he was also so numbed by all of this and he just didn't even, have the ability to see anymore what he was really doing and what he was contributing towards? And I think it's worth noting that this is not a unique case. There's millions of people out there who are also struggling with substance abuse disorder, and drug addiction is just a really, really difficult thing to deal with. And not a lot of people get access to help. Not a lot of people, when they die from overdoses, they don't get a huge federal investigation and millions of dollars poured into an investigation to figure out what happened to them, because they're not famous. They're not high A-list celebrities like Matthew Perry is. And like I said, I think it's great that, there was closure in this case in one way or another. But I think it's also important for us to recognize that this is not something that usually happens. A lot of people who die from overdoses, they go unnoticed, swept under the rug. Someone on, Reddit, in a really interesting chain of discussion talking about the war on drugs, they said, the war on drugs has always been a war on the poor. Mr. Perry's death and the investigation of his passing is one of many examples of our government's preference for the privileged class. Rest in peace to the many who deserve the investigation into their passing that Mr. Perry was afforded, but also rest in peace to Matthew Perry. Now, what did you guys think of today's case? I thought this was a really crazy one to research and look into, because there is just so much details of all of these different people that were involved. And it's just so awful to see, those who were supposed to be doctors, people who swore an oath to help protect and save people, to take actual advantage of those who are vulnerable. But if you guys want to see a second part to this case or see me talk about the other sentencing, let me know. If you guys have any thoughts about this case overall, please feel free to share any thoughts in the comment section down below. But otherwise, I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.